Captain Elias had sailed the oceans for decades, a veteran mariner known for his fearlessness. But there was one stretch of sea he had always avoided, a patch of water far from any known shipping lanes, rumored to be cursed. The locals called it the Drowned Abyss. One fateful night, a powerful storm pushed Captain Elias and his crew off course, straight into the heart of the Drowned Abyss. The sky was an angry black, and the waves rose like mountains, crashing down on the ship with terrifying force. Despite the chaos, Elias kept a tight grip on the wheel, trying to steer them to safety. But then, in the midst of the storm, the sea suddenly calmed. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creaking of the ship. The water beneath them was unnervingly still, like a giant glassy mirror reflecting the night sky. The crew, drenched and shaken, looked to their captain for guidance. Elias, sensing something was horribly wrong, ordered them to drop anchor and hold their positions until the storm passed completely. As they waited, a deep, rumbling noise echoed from the depths below, sending shivers down their spines. The water began to ripple, slowly at first, then violently, as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. Suddenly the ship lurched to one side, as though it had been struck by something colossal. Panic spread among the crew as they scrambled to figure out what was happening. They peered over the sides of the ship, trying to see through the dark waters, but all they could make out was a shadowy shape far below. It was then that they heard it, the low, mournful wail of something not of this world. It was a sound filled with despair, anger, and an ancient, unending hunger. Without warning, the ship was pulled downwards, the prow dipping sharply as if being sucked into a vortex. The crew clung to whatever they could, screaming as the ship was dragged toward the depths. Captain Elias, struggling to stay upright, shouted commands that were lost in the cacophony of the sea and the otherworldly wails. Just as suddenly as it started, the ship stopped sinking. The water was calm once more, but the silence now felt oppressive, almost suffocating. The crew, trembling, stared out at the sea, waiting for whatever horror had claimed them to reveal itself. Then they saw it, dozens of ghostly faces emerging from the water, pale and translucent. They hovered just below the surface, their eyes empty and hollow. These were the souls of sailors lost to the drowned abyss, eternally trapped in the watery grave. They began to whisper, their voices merging into a haunting chorus that filled the air with sorrow and madness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the voices were pleading with the living. Some of the crew members began to lose their minds, clutching their heads and screaming in agony. They jumped overboard, drawn to the faces in the water, where they were swiftly pulled under, their cries silenced as the sea claimed them. Captain Elias fought to stay focused, but the voices were everywhere, seeping into his thoughts. Just as he felt himself slipping into madness, he remembered the old sailor's tale, how the only way to escape the drowned abyss was to offer it something in return. With a heavy heart, Elias knew what he had to do. He grabbed an axe and cut the anchor line, then turned the wheel sharply, steering the ship away from the haunted waters. But as he did, he whispered a quiet prayer, offering his own soul to the abyss if it would spare his remaining crew. The sea accepted his bargain. As the ship sailed out of the drowned abyss, the whispers faded, and the sea returned to its natural state. The surviving crew members, dazed and broken, looked back to see the faces in the water disappear, vanishing into the depths. Captain Elias, his face pale and haunted, knew his time was short. The abyss would come for him just as it had claimed the others. But for now, his crew was safe. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Elias stood at the helm, staring into the endless sea, waiting for the inevitable. And when the time came, he went willingly, disappearing into the depths below, where the whispers never ceased.
In the desolate North Atlantic, there lies a stretch of ocean known as the Graveyard Sea, a place of chilling legends and vanished ships. Captain Merrick, a seasoned sailor with little regard for superstition, accepted a mission to chart this cursed region, dismissing the warnings of those who feared it. As Merrick's ship, the Resolute, entered the fog-enshrouded waters, the atmosphere shifted. The familiar sounds of the ocean, waves, seabirds, the creaking of the ship, were swallowed by an eerie silence. The crew, though experienced, grew uneasy, exchanging nervous glances as they sailed deeper into the mist. Days passed, but it felt as though they were sailing in circles, lost in an endless sea of fog. The sun barely penetrated the thick mist, casting a ghostly light that made it impossible to distinguish day from night. The crew spoke in hushed tones of shadows in the fog, and voices carried on the wind, but Marek dismissed their fears, insisting it was nothing more than their imaginations. On the third night, the fog briefly parted, revealing a sight that froze the blood in their veins. Emerging from the mist was a fleet of ancient ships, their sails torn and blackened, hulls encrusted with barnacles and seaweed. The vessels ranged from galleons to warships, relics from different eras, all impossibly intact, yet eerily still. The most unsettling sight was the crews of these ghost ships. Skeletal figures, dressed in the tattered remains of naval uniforms and armor, stood motionless on the decks, their empty eye sockets fixed on the Resolute. Marek ordered the crew to change course, but no matter where they turned, the phantom fleet followed, tightening its circle around them. Desperation set in as Marek and his crew realized there was no escape. The ships closed in, their silence more terrifying than any battle cry. Then, from the lead ship, a figure stepped forward, a skeletal captain, his flesh decayed, his eyes hollow. He raised a bony hand, and the sea around them began to churn violently. "Who dares to trespass in the Graveyard Sea?" the ghostly captain asked, his voice a dry, rasping echo. "I am Captain Marek of the Resolute," Marek replied, his voice faltering. "We mean no harm. We seek only safe passage." The ghost captain's hollow laugh sent chills down their spines. "There is no safe passage here. You have entered the domain of the dead, and now you shall join us." With a wave of his hand, the sea beneath the Resolute erupted in a frenzy of black, oily tendrils. The crew screamed as the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around their limbs and pulling them into the icy depths. Marek fought desperately against the pull, but it was futile. The water was freezing, sapping his strength as it rose around him. As the last of his crew disappeared beneath the waves, Marek caught one final glimpse of the phantom fleet, their ghostly forms fading into the mist. With his ship sinking beneath him, Marek succumbed to the darkness, the cold tendrils dragging him down. The next day, the fog lifted, and the Graveyard Sea appeared as calm as ever. The Resolute was gone, vanished without a trace. But in the years that followed, sailors spoke of a new ship among the ghostly fleet, a ship with the name the Resolute etched into its rotting hull, captained by a man with empty eyes, doomed to sail the haunted waters for eternity.